Okay, let's unpack this. You navigate the world online every day, right? Sending emails, posting updates, maybe even running a business.
Yeah, just part of life now.
But what if there are systems, kind of invisible systems, that are quietly limiting your reach or shaping what info you see?
Or even deciding bigger things, like if you can get on a plane or use banking services.
Exactly. It sounds a bit like science fiction almost.
It really does, but the sources we're looking at suggest it's, well, very much our reality. We're talking about what some call the unseen chains of modern control.
Right, operating just beneath the surface of everything we do online.
Mm-hmm.
I've got these excerpts from Dmitry Gorbatenko's logbook, and the titles alone are pretty evocative. The Unseen Chains, The Shadow Hand, Digital Liberation, The Algorithmic Shadow.
They really hint at someone grappling with these hidden controls, digital limits, maybe even bigger things like financial inequality or this idea of a digital dystopia.
And then we have this core article, The Unseen Chains, Why Shadowbans and Blacklists by U.S. government and corporations are impossible to monitor or correct. That suddenly gets right into the nuts and bolts.
It does. It tries to lay out the mechanics of how these systems actually work, or rather how they work in secret.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to use these sources to really get a handle on these invisible walls, shadow banning, blacklisting.
Just figure out who's building them, basically.
Yeah, and why are they so incredibly difficult for you, the individual listener, to even spot, let alone try to challenge?
And what happens when they do impact you? What are the real-world consequences? Because they can be significant.
It's about understanding this profound lack of transparency, right? And how that secrecy makes it almost impossible for the person being targeted to do anything about it.
Exactly. It's like trying to fight a ghost, as you said. You can't hit back at something you can't see or prove exists.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. Let's start with the basics. What are we actually talking about? Shadow banning and blacklisting, what are they?
Okay, so at their core, they're both ways of excluding or suppressing someone or something, but they work differently. And critically, the person affected often has no idea, or at least no clear idea, why.
Right. The article defines shadow banning as essentially invisible suppression. You might hear other names for it too, like stealth banning, ghost banning.
Or the platforms themselves might use softer terms like content reduction or demotion. Avoids the negative word ban.
Yeah, exactly. And the trick is your content, maybe a post or a comment, looks total fine to you. You log in, you see it, seems normal.
But for everyone else, it's basically hidden or buried so deep in their feeds nobody sees it, or it just won't show up in searches.
So you think you're engaging, but you're effectively talking to yourself. Like your comment is visible to you, but no one else can see it.
Precisely. Or your tweet, your Instagram post gets 0 likes, 0 comments, because it's just not being distributed to your followers or showing up anywhere people might discover it.
And apparently this isn't some brand new thing invented by Facebook or Twitter. The source mentions it goes back way back to the 1980s, something called a twitbit.
Yeah, on old online systems like Citadel, BBS. And the actual term shadow ban apparently popped up on the website, something awful around 2001. So the concept's been around.
What was the point back then?
Yeah.
Same as now.
Pretty much. It's often about managing, let's say, problematic users discreetly. Spammers, trolls, people breaking the rules.
So the idea is to just frustrate them, make them think the site is broken or that no one cares, so they just leave.
Exactly. They get frustrated and wander off without causing a big argument, without realizing they were actually targeted. That way, they don't just immediately make a new account and start over. It's meant to be a quiet solution.
Okay, so that's shadow banning, making you invisible without telling you.
Yeah.
How does blacklisting compare?
Blacklisting is usually, well, more overt. It's about actively denying someone, an individual, a company, whatever, access to something specific, like a privilege, a service, a job, an opportunity.
Because they've been labeled as, what, undesirable? A threat?
Something like that, yeah. And typically, you are where you're being denied the thing. You can't get the job, you can't board the flight, your transaction is blocked.
But similar to shadow banning, the process of getting on that list and the exact reason why, that part is often hidden.
That's the key similarity the sources point out. The why and how you landed on the list can be just as opaque, just as secret.
And blacklisting itself, that's got a much longer history, right? Pre-internet stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. The source notes the term goes back to the 1610s, and it was used in employment contexts back in the late 1800s, like against union organizers. Most people probably know the Hollywood blacklist from the mid-20th century.
Right, that's a famous example.
So it's an old tool of control, really, just adapted for the modern age. And we see it everywhere today. Employment, like we said, maybe illegally retaliating against whistleblowers, but it's super hard to prove.
And governments use it a lot.
It's extensively. For national security, foreign policy, law enforcement, think watch lists. And then there's commercial blacklisting, like you mentioned earlier, email IP blacklists stopping spam, or international sanctions lists freezing assets.
Okay, so different methods, one hides you, one blocks you, but the common thread is this lack of transparency. You don't know the rules of the game.
That's the crucial link the sources emphasize. Both systems often rely on opaque decision-making. Who gets targeted? Why? The person affected is often left completely in the dark.
And it sounds like the language used is part of that strategy, keeping things murky.
Definitely. The article points out companies prefer softer words, right? Demoting, visibility filtering. Governments might say watch list instead of blacklist. It all helps downplay the impact and maintain that secrecy.
So who are the ones actually doing this? Who holds this power to put up these invisible walls?
Well, the power really lies in two main places. The big private tech platforms that basically own the digital public square, and government agencies that operate with significant authority, often citing things like national security.
Okay, let's talk about the companies first. The corporate veils, as the source calls them.
Social media is the obvious one. Your big players, X, Meta, TikTok, YouTube, Reddit. It's widely understood they use these kinds of techniques.
And their stated reason is usually enforcing their rules, like against hate speech, spam, bots, maybe using certain banned hashtags.
That's the official line, yeah. Managing guideline violations. But again, they're usually very reluctant to actually say shadow banning.
Right. We hear demotion, visibility filtering. The article mentions Zuckerberg talking about demotions at Meta and Instagram's head, Mosseri, discussing limiting the visibility of inappropriate content, even if it doesn't strictly break rules. Academics might call it reduction.
Exactly. It's often about that quiet management.
Right.
But it's not just social media. We talked about employment blacklisting companies intentionally keeping people out of jobs, sometimes illegally, making it almost impossible to prove you were blacklisted for, say, blowing the whistle.
And those commercial blacklists, too. Cybersecurity firms, email providers, like Barracuda Network's IP blacklists, get on one of those, and suddenly your emails might just vanish for tons of people.
A huge impact on communication for businesses or individuals. Now, flip to the other side, the state's secret lists. The U.S. government, for example, runs some really extensive blacklisting systems.
Often justified by national security.
That's usually the rationale. This is where you get things like the FBI's big terrorist screening database, the TSDB.
And that feeds into lists like the TSA's no-fly list.
Correct. And if you end up on one of those, the consequences can be pretty severe. You can be denied travel, subjected to constant questioning, even detained.
And the big issue that the source highlights is just how secret it all is.
Intense secrecy. The criteria for getting on these lists can be really vague, maybe overbroad. The evidence used against you is often classified secret.
And they won't even tell you if you're on the list.
Often no. They use that neither confirm nor deny policy, which you can imagine makes it incredibly difficult to even start challenging it.
Wow. And then there are the economic blacklists run by the government, like Opaque's SDN list.
Yes, the specially designated nationals list. People or companies can land on that for suspected links to terrorism, narcotics trafficking, weapons proliferation, human rights abuses, or just for foreign policy reasons.
And the impact there is financially devastating.
Completely. U.S. individuals and companies are prohibited from dealing with anyone on the SDN list. Their assets in the U.S. are frozen. They're basically cut off from the U.S. financial system, and often the global one, too. It can destroy businesses, livelihoods, and other agencies like State and Commerce have their own lists, too.
The sources also mention another angle, government agencies leaning on the private platforms.
Yeah, this is a really critical piece of the puzzle, this interplay. There's significant concern, backed up by investigations and lawsuits, that government agencies are pressuring platforms to moderate or remove content.
Especially around sensitive stuff, like debates about misinformation, election integrity, public health.
Exactly. That Murthy v. Missouri case brought this into the spotlight. even though the Supreme Court ultimately dismissed it based on standing, basically saying the plaintiffs couldn't prove direct harm to them. The case itself laid out serious allegations of government coercion or significant encouragement pushing platforms toward censorship.
So it creates this murky situation. Is my post disappearing because of a platform rule? Or because someone in the government didn't like it and made a call?
Precisely. It blurs the lines of accountability. Who made the decision? It's hard for you, the user, to know. And corporate incentives muddy the waters too. Platforms want to keep users engaged, avoid controversy, and sometimes there's even value in selling blacklisting data or services. It all pushes towards opacity.
And all this complexity and secrecy, it leads directly to what the article calls the opaque labyrinth. Basically, why trying to check if you're affected or monitor your status is next to impossible.
Yeah, the core reason is simple. These systems are designed to be secret. On the company side, they often deny shadow banning exists, use those euphemisms, or just blame glitches or the algorithm.
Like, Facebook apparently doesn't tell news publishers their pages are being demoted in the feed.
Right. Or Instagram doesn't publish a definitive list of all the banned hashtags that might get your content hidden. You're left guessing.
And on the government side, it's shielded by national security claims.
Yeah.
That whole neither confirm nor deny thing for watch lists.
So you can't figure out the rules. You don't know the specific criteria or thresholds for getting flagged. You can't assess your own risk, really.
Then there's the technology itself. Algorithmic obscurity, the black box problem.
Yeah, so much of this is automated now. Content moderation, adding names to watch lists. It relies heavily on complex algorithms, often machine learning or AI.
But how these algorithms actually work, that's kept secret.
Often, yes. It's proprietary corporate information, or it might even be classified government methods. So you can't look inside the black box to see why it flagged your perfectly innocent travel photo as problematic, or why it decided your name matched someone on a watch list. This really gets at that algorithmic shadow idea from Gorbatenko's logbook, this hidden code running in the background, making decisions.
And these algorithms, they're not foolproof, are they? The source mentioned potential for bias, for errors.
Big time. Algorithms learn from data, and if the data reflects existing societal biases, the algorithm will replicate and even amplify them. Plus, they just make mistakes. That Mozilla study finding a 70% misclassification rate for AI flagging hate speech on YouTube, that's staggering.
70%. And if that error happens inside a system you can't even see into.
How do you even begin to challenge it? You can't. And their sheer complexity makes independent audits really tough. You often have to trust the company or agency itself to tell you if its system is working fairly and accurately.
And often, the worst part is, you don't even know you've been hit. Especially with shadow banning, you're the unknowing subject.
Exactly. There's usually no notification. Hey, just letting you know we've decided to hide your posts from now on. You don't get that email.
For government lists, you might only find out when you try to do something and get blocked. Like trying to fly.
Right. That's often the first time someone realizes they're on a watch list. So for social media, you're left trying to be a detective.
Like noticing a sudden drop in likes or comments, searching for your posts from a friend's account, or the incognito mode to see if they show up.
Yeah, trying all these workarounds, but it's super unreliable. The platform can always say, oh, it was just a glitch, or the algorithm changed, or your content just wasn't very engaging this time.
Plausible deniability.
Totally. Which can lead to this feeling of being gaslit. You suspect you're being suppressed, maybe you see patterns, but you lack hard proof. The platform denies it. You start questioning yourself.
And with no real independent oversight, you're basically asking the entity doing the suppressing to investigate itself. Seems like a conflict of interest.
It absolutely is. It helps ensure that this impossibility of checking, this opacity, is maintained by the very gatekeepers running the systems.
Okay, so checking is basically impossible. What if you do find out somehow or have a really strong suspicion? Can you appeal? Can you get it corrected? The article title says correction is impossible too.
Yeah, and unfortunately the sources suggest that's largely true. The same secrecy that stops you from checking also makes getting off these lists or getting restrictions lifted incredibly difficult, sometimes futile.
What about appealing to the companies?
Well, for some overt actions, like if your account gets banned or a specific post is taken down, yeah, platforms often have some kind of appeal process. Reddit, Twitch, they have portals.
But for shadow banning, something they don't even admit to.
There's usually no specific path for that. You end up trying generic customer support, maybe sending emails into a void, often getting automated, templated replies that don't address the actual issue.
And even for the formal appeals, the burden of proof is still on you,
Yep.
right, the user.
Which is the fundamental problem. How can you prove you were wrongly targeted when you don't know the specific reason, the criteria they used, or the data that flagged you in the first place?
So the appeals can feel kind of performative.
They can, yeah. Automated denials are common. The timelines are often unclear. How long does a shadow ban last? How long does an appeal take? There's no guarantee you'll get your full visibility back, even if they admit an error.
It seems different in Europe, though. The source mentioned the EU's Digital Services Act pushing for better systems.
That's right. The DSA is forcing platforms operating in the EU to be more transparent and provide more effective complaint and redress mechanisms. That's a contrast to the US, where laws like Section 230 give platforms broad immunity, which impacts accountability, and courts have sometimes struck down state-level transparency laws.
Okay, so corporate appeals are tough. What about appealing government lists? That sounds even harder given the national security angle.
It is incredibly daunting. For the travel watch lists, like the no-fly list, there's a program called DHS TRIP-P, the Traveler Redress Inquiry Program.
So you can ask them to check if you've been wrongly flagged?
You can submit an inquiry, yes, but groups like the ACLU have slammed it as wholly ineffective and lacking basic due process. You submit your info, but you generally aren't told if you were actually on a list, why you were on it, or even if the problem, assuming there was one, has been fixed.
You can't see the evidence against you, can't challenge it.
Nope. No opportunity to confront or rebut the evidence. It's a black box appeal for a black box listing.
Wow. And what about getting off something like that Opaque SDN list, the economic blacklist?
That's a whole different level of difficulty. There is a formal process you can file, what's called an administrative reconsideration petition with OFAC.
But it sounds intense.
It is. It's incredibly complex, very demanding legally and factually. It often takes well over a year just for OFAC to review it. You need to provide meticulous evidence, often requiring specialized legal counsel who deals with sanctions law.
Which sounds expensive.
Extremely, which straight away creates a barrier for many people or smaller entities. And even after all that, there's absolutely no guarantee of success. Again, you might be trying to disprove secret evidence.
So that challenge of secret evidence just keeps coming up. It makes any real defense impossible.
It's the core problem. How do you defend yourself against accusations you're not allowed to see? In fact, a U.S. district judge actually found the government's main watch list system, the TSDB, unconstitutional, partly because the standards were vague, the system was secret, and there was no meaningful way for people to contest being put on it. That ruling really underscored these systemic due process failures.
So it really does sound like these appeal systems, both corporate and government, can end up being, like the source said, procedural facades. They look like a path, but there's no real substance.
That's often the feeling people get, yeah. They provide the appearance of fairness without the reality, especially when the core information remains hidden. And the sheer cost of legal help for challenging government lists creates this huge inequality. If you have money and resources, you might have a slim chance. If you don't, forget it.
Okay, so checking is impossible, correcting is impossible. What are the actual consequences then when you're caught in these unseen systems? How does it mess up people's lives?
The impacts are serious and they ripple outwards. They're not just minor inconveniences. One huge one is the chilling effect on free speech.
Ah, right. That idea that just the fear of some hidden penalty makes you censor yourself.
Exactly. You start second-guessing what you say online. Should I post about this controversial topic? Should I voice this dissenting opinion? You don't know what invisible line you might cross that gets you shadow banned or flagged internally somewhere. It ties right back to that unseen chains idea from the logbook, feeling constrained even if you don't know exactly why.
And does this affect everyone equally?
Probably not. The sources suggest it disproportionately impacts people who are already pushing boundaries or challenging the status quo: activists, journalists, researchers, marginalized communities. If their voices are quietly suppressed, it can really warp the public conversation, maybe even undermine democratic debate.
Groups like the Brennan Center have pointed this out.
Yeah.
About surveillance, feeding watch lists, and chilling speech.
Yeah, particularly in minority communities. And even the FTC soliciting complaints about potential censorship shows this is a recognized concern at various levels.
And beyond speech, there are big economic and reputational hits.
Huge. We mentioned employment blacklisting that can literally end careers, cause immense financial hardship.
And being on that OFAC SDN list.
Economically devastating. Frozen assets, cut off from banking, businesses ruined, livelihoods destroyed. It really highlights the inequality of the modern financial system concept from the logbook. These systems can just wipe people out financially.
Even for creators or businesses just relying on social media, getting shadow banned could be catastrophic for their income, right?
Right.
If suddenly no one sees their stuff.
Absolutely. If your visibility drops to zero, your income stream can dry up overnight. And then there's the reputational damage, whether it's secret or public. Being labeled a spammer, a security risk, a sanctioned entity sticks to you, even if it was a complete mistake.
This all sounds like a massive erosion of basic fairness, of due process rights.
It really is. Think about fundamental rights. Being told what you're accused of, seeing the evidence, being presumed innocent. Secret lists with vague criteria, no notification, appeals that don't work. It completely flips the script. It feels like you're treated as guilty until you can somehow prove you're innocent, using information you don't have access to.
Those ACLU criticisms and the judge's ruling on the watch list system really drive that home.
They highlight these deep, systemic problems with due process.
And what about just the stress of it all? The psychological impact?
Oh, it must be immense. Imagine the constant anxiety, the stress, maybe even paranoia, wondering if you're being targeted by forces you can't see or fight. That feeling of powerlessness, of injustice, that algorithmic shadow, that potential digital dystopia. It's exhausting just trying to figure out if you're shadow banned, let alone trying to fix it.
So the overall effect isn't just on individuals, it's broader. Like a society becoming more cautious, more distrustful.
Yeah, potentially. A chilling effect can lead to more conformity, less critical thinking expressed openly. And the source really emphasizes how these systems hit vulnerable groups harder. They might be more likely to be flagged by biased algorithms, and they usually have fewer resources, money, time, legal help to fight back if they're wrongly targeted. The impossibility of correction is even worse for those already on the margins.
Wow. It paints a really stark picture. Hidden controls, secret lists, with really damaging real-world consequences. So, what's the way out? The sources must talk about reforms.
They do. It's clear that just letting these opaque systems continue isn't sustainable if we care about fairness and rights. The article points towards needing systemic reforms across several areas.
Okay, like what?
Primarily, much greater transparency, meaningful due process guarantees, real accountability for the algorithms being used, and stronger legal and regulatory oversight.
So transparency means what? Publishing the rules.
Yeah, things like clear, specific, publicly available criteria for why someone might be shadow banned, put on a watch list, or have their content demoted, notifying people when these actions are taken against them, and regular, detailed transparency reports from both platforms and government agencies showing how often these tools are used, against whom, and with what effect.
Okay, transparency first, then meaningful due process.
That means having appeal processes that are actually accessible, fair, and timely. Maybe with independent review bodies, not just internal ones. Crucially, it means giving people a real chance to see and challenge the evidence or the reasoning behind the restriction, which requires disclosing that information, and a clear right to get errors corrected.
Makes sense. And algorithmic accountability. How do you make a black box accountable?
That's tough, but essential. It involves things like requirements for independent audits of these algorithms to check for bias, check for accuracy, pushing for more explainability, making it possible to understand why an algorithm made a specific decision, and building in ethical considerations and human oversight right from the design stage, not just reacting after harm occurs.
Being proactive, not just reactive.
Especially given the scale these automated systems operate at.
And the last one, stronger legal and regulatory frameworks.
Right. This means taking a hard look at existing laws in places like the U.S., like Section 230 immunity for platforms, and asking if they need reform to better protect individual rights online. It also means learning from other places, like the EU's Digital Services Act, which is trying to impose stricter rules on platforms regarding transparency and user appeals.
So it sounds like it really requires a fundamental shift in priorities.
Yeah.
Putting individual rights and accountability ahead of, say, corporate convenience or unchecked government secrecy.
That's really the core challenge, I think. It's about bringing these hidden systems, these shadow hands and algorithmic shadows out of the dark, making sure they operate within the bounds of law and fairness, not outside of them.
This has been, wow, a really deep dive into these unseen chains. It's pretty clear these systems are widespread, deliberately kept hidden, and incredibly hard for you, the listener, to see or fight back against.
Yeah, and just understanding how they work or how they're kept from being understood and recognizing their impact on basic rights, on people's livelihoods, on public conversation. That understanding is really the crucial first step. It's what allows us to start demanding the transparency and the due process that are needed.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. As you go about your day, online, interacting, maybe applying for things, traveling, just think about this. Given everything we've discussed, how algorithms and secret lists can quietly shape what you see and what you can access. How might these unseen chains be subtly influencing your world, your opportunities, maybe even your opinions, without you ever realizing it?
It's definitely something to keep in the back of your mind.
Absolutely. That's all for this deep dive.